The 72-Day Miracle of the Andes. Chapter 1. The Flight. Imagine waking up one morning, saying goodbye to your family, and boarding an airplane. You believe you are going on a short trip. You expect laughter. You expect conversation. You expect to reach your destination within a few hours. You have absolutely no idea that your life is about to become one of the most extraordinary survival stories ever recorded. On October 13, 1972, a group of young people from Uruguay boarded a Fairchild FH-227D aircraft. Many of them were members of the Old Christians Rugby Club. They were traveling towards Santiago, Chile, where they planned to play a rugby match. There were 45 people aboard the aircraft, including passengers and crew. For the passengers, it was supposed to be an ordinary journey, but the route took them toward one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, the Andes Mountains. The mountains stretched across the horizon like an enormous wall. Snow covered the peaks. Clouds surrounded the aircraft. Visibility was poor. The passengers probably had no idea how quickly everything could change. At first, nothing seemed unusual. People talked. Some looked out the windows. Others simply waited for the journey to end. But somewhere above the mountains, a terrible mistake was developing. The pilots believed they had reached a position where they could begin descending towards Santiago. They had not. The aircraft was still surrounded by the Andes, and the mountains were directly in their path. Then, suddenly, the world outside the windows changed. A mountain ridge appeared. There was almost no time. The pilots tried to climb, but the aircraft could not clear the mountain. The plane struck the mountain. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft broke apart. People were thrown from their seat. The fuselage tore through the snow. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The survivors were trapped high in the Andes. They had no idea that their nightmare had only just begun. Chapter 2. The First Hours. When the survivors regained consciousness, they faced something almost impossible to understand. They were alive, but many people around them were dead or seriously injured. The aircraft had become their shelter. The surrounding mountains were covered in snow. The temperature was brutally cold. There was no normal road, no nearby town, no telephone, no hospital, no obvious way home. The survivors immediately began helping the injured. They used whatever they could find. Seats became makeshift beds. Parts of the aircraft became shelter. Snow was melted for drinking water. They had very limited food, and every hour became a battle against the cold. At first, they believed rescuers would find them. After all, an aircraft had disappeared. Search teams would surely come. They tried to remain hopeful. Aircraft flew over the mountains looking for the wreckage. But there was a terrible problem. The plane was mostly white. It was lying among enormous fields of snow. From the air, the wreckage was extremely difficult to see. The survivors had no way of knowing that search aircraft were struggling to locate them. Days passed. The people inside the fuselage waited. They listened for aircraft. They looked toward the sky. Every distant sound created hope. Maybe that was a rescue plane. Maybe help was coming. But then the sound disappeared, and the mountains became silent again. Chapter 3. The search ends. This is where the story becomes even more difficult. The survivors eventually learned that the official search had been stopped. They had been missing for days. From the outside world, the assumption was becoming clear. The people aboard the aircraft were probably dead, but inside the wreckage, people were still alive. 16 survivors would eventually make it home. At that moment, however, nobody knew that. The survivors had to confront a terrifying reality. Nobody was coming. They had to save themselves. The food they had brought onto the aircraft was disappearing rapidly. There was no way to replace it. The mountains offered almost nothing they could eat. There were no farms, no trees producing food, no stores, no animals wandering around waiting to become dinner. There was snow, rock, ice, and human beings trying desperately to survive. As the days passed, hunger became more powerful. The survivors became weaker. Some were already seriously injured. Others became sick. And then another disaster struck. An avalanche buried the wreckage. The people who had survived the crash were suddenly trapped inside their own shelter. Several more people died. The survivors dug themselves out, but their situation had become even worse. They were no longer simply waiting for rescue. They were fighting starvation. Chapter 4. The Impossible Decision. There is one part of this story that is extremely difficult to discuss, but it is central to understanding how the survivors stayed alive. The dead could no longer survive. The living could. The survivors eventually faced an unimaginable decision. They had no food. They were surrounded by the bodies of people who had died. After intense discussion, discussion, and emotional struggle. Some survivors decided they would consume the bodies of those who had died. This was not about greed. It was not about violence. It was a desperate response to starvation. They believed that if they did nothing, everyone would die. The decision caused enormous emotional pain. These were their friends, their teammates, their family members, people they had known before the crash. The choice was psychologically devastating, but survival sometimes forces people into situations they never imagined possible. The survivors continued. They ate small amounts. They shared what little food they had, and they tried to preserve enough strength to find a way out. This decision later shocked the world. But when the full story became known, many people also recognized the extraordinary circumstances surrounding it. These people had not chosen the mountains. They had not chosen the crash. They had not chosen starvation. They were simply trying to remain alive. Chapter 5: Hope Returns. The survivors knew that waiting forever was impossible. Someone had to leave the wreckage. Someone had to search for a way down. But the Andes were enormous. Walking through those mountains without proper equipment could easily mean death. The survivors began discussing an expedition. They needed strong people. They needed clothing. They needed food. They needed a plan. Among the survivors was Nando Parrado. His story would become one of the most remarkable parts of the entire disaster. Parrado had suffered terrible injuries during the crash, but he survived. He eventually became convinced that there had to be a way out. The problem was simple. Which direction? How far? And what would happen when they reached the mountains? They had no maps showing their exact location. They had little protection against the cold. They had almost no food, and they were surrounded by some of the most difficult terrain imaginable. Still, they prepared. The survivors turned pieces of the wreckage into equipment. They used whatever resources they had. They understood one important fact. If they stayed where they were, they might eventually die. If they walked, they might die. But walking at least gave them a chance. Chapter 6: Into the Mountains. Eventually, the attempt began. Parrado and Roberto Canessa became central figures in the expedition. They climbed away from the wreckage. Every step required energy. Every step consumed calories they could barely afford to lose. The mountains were enormous. The distance was difficult to judge. A mountain that looked close could take hours to reach. A valley that looked like a possible route could end in a wall of rock. The men continued. They climbed higher. They walked through snow. They struggled against exhaustion. At night, they had to protect themselves from freezing temperatures. They knew that one mistake could end the expedition, but they continued. Meanwhile, back at the wreckage, the remaining survivors waited. Their friends had left. They did not know whether they would ever return. Every hour became a test of patience. Every day became a test of hope. Chapter 7: The Mountains Keep Fighting Back. The expedition was not a straight walk toward civilization. The Andes constantly created new obstacles. Steep slopes, deep snow, extreme cold, rocky terrain, exhaustion, and hunger. The men had almost no margin for error. Their bodies were already weakened. They had survived weeks on extremely limited food, yet they kept moving. At times, they climbed toward what appeared to be the highest point. They believed that once they reached the top, they might finally see civilization. Then they climbed, and climbed, and climbed. Finally, they reached a high point. And what did they see? More mountains. The realization was devastating. The horizon was not filled with a nearby town. It was filled with enormous peaks. For a moment, their hope must have felt almost completely destroyed. But they had already come too far. Turning around meant returning to the wreckage. Continuing meant entering unknown territory. They chose to continue. Chapter 8: A Sign of Civilization. Then something happened that changed everything. The men began seeing signs that they were moving toward civilization. They found evidence that humans had been in the region. And eventually, they encountered something they desperately needed: a river valley. This suggested that they were descending. That meant there was a possibility of reaching inhabited areas. But they still had a huge problem. They needed to find people. They continued walking. Eventually, after days of traveling through the mountains, they saw something unbelievable: a person. At first, they could hardly believe what they were seeing. They were exhausted. They were dirty. They were extremely thin. They had been missing for weeks. But there, across the river, was a Chilean muleteer named Sergio Catalan. The men tried to communicate. The river was between them. They could not simply walk across. Instead, they managed to send a message. The message explained that there were other survivors still trapped in the mountains. This was the moment their story changed forever. Someone finally knew they were alive. Chapter 9: The World Learns They Are Alive. Catalan understood that something extraordinary had happened. He traveled to get help. Eventually, authorities learned that survivors had been found. The news was unbelievable. For weeks, the outside world had believed that Everyone aboard Flight 571 had died. Now there was proof. Survivors were alive, and they were still waiting in the mountains. The rescue operation began, but rescuing them was not simple. The mountains were dangerous. The wreckage was located in an extremely remote area. Helicopters had to navigate difficult terrain. The survivors were weak. Some could barely walk. But finally, rescue aircraft reached them. One by one, the survivors were taken away from the mountains. After 72 days, the nightmare was ending. 16 people had survived. They had endured the crash, the cold, the avalanche, starvation, the psychological trauma, and the impossible journey through the mountains. They were finally going home. Chapter 10. The aftermath. When the survivors returned to civilization, the world was stunned. People wanted to understand how anyone could have survived for so long. The story became international news, but the survivors faced another challenge. They had to explain what had happened, especially the decision involving the bodies of those who had died. The revelation shocked many people, but the survivors explained the reality they had faced. They were starving. They had no alternative source of food, and they believed consuming the bodies was necessary to remain alive. Over time, the story became known as the miracle of the Andes. The survivors themselves continued living with memories that would never disappear. They had lost friends. They had lost family members. They had experienced things most people could never imagine. But they had also demonstrated something extraordinary. The human desire to survive can be incredibly powerful. Chapter 11. What this story really means. The Andes disaster is often described as a story about survival, and it certainly is. But it is also a story about teamwork. Nobody survived completely alone. People shared food. They cared for injured passengers. They created shelter. They discussed difficult decisions. They supported one another. And eventually, 2 men were willing to walk into the unknown to search for help. That decision saved lives. The story also teaches us something uncomfortable. Human beings can adapt to situations that seem impossible. When normal choices disappear, people sometimes have to make choices they never believed they could make. The survivors did not become heroes because they were fearless. They became remarkable because they continued despite fear. They continued despite hunger. They continued despite grief. They continued despite knowing that nobody might come to save them. Chapter 12. The final journey. Think about the moment Parrado and Canessa finally reached civilization. They had spent weeks surrounded by snow. They had watched friends die. They had walked through mountains with almost no food. And now they were finally looking at another human being. Imagine what that moment must have felt like. For the first time in weeks, there was proof that civilization still existed. There was food. There was shelter. There was warmth. There was hope. But there was also another responsibility. They knew that other survivors were still waiting. They could not simply celebrate their own rescue. They had to tell the rescuers where the others were. That information eventually led rescuers back to the wreckage. And the remaining survivors were brought home. 16 people survived. 29 people did not. The numbers alone cannot explain what happened. Behind every number was a person, a family, a friend, a life that had ended in the mountains. Chapter 13. Why we still remember them. More than half a century later, the story of the Andes survivors remains famous. Books have been written about it. Documentaries have been produced. Films have recreated parts of the disaster. But the real story remains more powerful than fiction. Because it actually happened. These were ordinary people placed in an extraordinary situation. They were not professional survival experts. They were not specially trained mountain explorers. They were passengers on a flight. And yet, after disaster struck, they had to learn how to survive. They had to become engineers, climbers, doctors, decision-makers, and rescuers. They had to transform pieces of a destroyed airplane into tools. They had to melt snow for water. They had to ration food. They had to protect themselves from the cold. And eventually, they had to cross the mountains. Chapter 14. The lesson. Perhaps the most powerful lesson from the Andes is simple. Never underestimate the human will to survive. When everything familiar disappears, people can discover strength they never knew they possessed. The survivors had almost every reason to give up. The rescue search had ended. The weather was brutal. Food was disappearing. People around them were dying. The mountains seemed endless. Yet they continued. They found solutions to problems that seemed impossible. And when there was no easy solution, they created one. Their story reminds us that survival is not always about strength. Sometimes it is about making one more decision, taking one more step, climbing one more mountain, waiting one more night, and refusing to believe that the story is over, ending the question. On October 13th, 1972, 45 people boarded a plane. They expected to travel to Chile. Instead, their aircraft crashed into the Andes. For 72 days, the world believed they were gone. But inside those mountains, 16 people were still fighting to live. They survived an aircraft crash. They survived freezing temperatures. They survived an avalanche. They survived starvation. And eventually, 2 survivors walked through the mountains until they found help. Their story became known as the miracle of the Andes. But perhaps the most incredible part is not simply that they survived. It is that when almost every reason to hope had disappeared, they continued searching for one. And sometimes, survival begins with exactly that. One small piece of hope. One more step. One more day. And the decision not to give up. If you found this story fascinating, subscribe to the channel. Because tomorrow, we will explore another true story that sounds almost impossible, but actually happened.